A confident seller is hoping to squeeze out some cash from Rick for a Porsche 911 engine. It's not every day you see Rick outside his cozy shop, but when a young man comes with a Porsche 911 Carrera engine, he has to go and see for himself. The young seller claims he works in a junkyard and he knows his engine. We will see about that when the screws start turning. He's hoping to get between $3,600 to $4,500 for it. Rick admires the engine sitting at the back of the seller's truck. He knew how well-balanced Porsche engines are.
Man, how much you want for it?
Nah, it's not for sale. I'm selling what is in the back.
Oh.
I like to sell it about $4,500. I think the less I can get is around
The seller says he initially bought the engine to build a Baja, whatever that means. Rick asks if he could take a closer look at it. The first thing Rick noticed was the water damage on it. He asks the seller if the engine was kept by the ocean. The seller says it was, that the damage was just outside and not inside. Yeah, right. Rick has been in this business long enough to know how scary it is to buy anything from a junkyard.
This motor right here, it's a 6-cylinder, water-cooled, pancake motor. They're much better balanced. You put a much lower profile on the motor. Porsche engineers really built some fast cars.
Back in the 1930s,
Rick went straight to the point. He asked the seller how much he wanted for the engine. The seller, without hesitation, says $4,500. Rick, ignoring the asking price from the seller, stated his concerns about the water damage. He knows he has to call in an expert to look at it. The seller was pretty confident that the mechanic coming would increase his chances of getting a better deal.
because I want to build a Baja.
I off-road a lot too, and the 6-cylinder Porsche motors are great for Baja. Do you mind if I take a closer look at it?
Take a look.
Okay.
The expert came in. He opened the floor by saying he's a huge fan of Porsche engines. He then went on a lecturing spree, stating all the things that make the Porsche engines so great. He says the brand new of the engine usually cost an arm and a leg, somewhere in the range of $15,000 to $20,000. The seller's eyes lit up like the Eiffel Tower on Christmas Eve. The expert says there are several uses for the engine.
How much you want for it?
$4,500.
It's a cool motor, but I got some concerns. It looks like water damage.
Rick asks the expert what his concerns were. The expert examines the engine closely. The seller looks on nervously. Could he be hiding something? The expert says that there are some compartments that are opened that should have been closed. He starts pointing at the parts. He says the damage on the outside will also be going on the inside to an extent. This is not looking good for the seller.
Well, you know I'm a Porsche fan. Porsche's definitely got their act together. I mean, they're great performance motors. They're lightweight. They got a great low center of gravity, because everything's set down on the bottom like that.
The expert says he has to open up the engine to see the extent of the damage. The seller wasn't having any of it. He says the expert is wrong, that it's a good engine. He says that if Rick brings a good mechanic, he will tell him that there's nothing wrong with it. The expert and Rick looked at each other. They were lost for words. The expert says he's a good mechanic, and he's honest about the state of the engine.
Some water damage, and it looks like it's been sitting for a long time.
Yeah, you know, there's a lot of compartments that should have been closed up, and they're all open. When things are left open, like this throttle body is left exposed and these fuel rails are left exposed.
The seller was still insisting on Rick bringing a good mechanic. Rick says the expert he called was tested and trusted. The seller was still insisting. The expert had to leave. Rick was happy the expert was a cool guy. It could have gotten ugly because the seller was starting to get rude. Rick told the seller that he will pass on it. He cannot buy something that he doesn't know what's going underneath. They shook hands and parted ways.
The only way to make sure it's right is I gotta open it up.
You're wrong. It's good engine. It's not gonna make you no problems. If you bring a good mechanic, he will tell you what to do.
Well, brother, they did bring a good mechanic.
A seller is expecting millions of dollars. For his violin, will Rick give it to him? A seller comes into Pawn Stars carrying a Stradivarius violin, but he's not here to serenade Rick. The seller says it's dated 1763. He says he found it in a cedar chest in a house he bought. He says he's gonna make millions from it. That's a huge leap. Rick, examining the violin closely, asks if there's any paperwork. The seller says no, strike one. Rick says the name was originally Stradivarius.
I have a Stradivarius violin dated 1763.
a Stradivarius?
Stradivarius violin.
That's what I thought you said.
Rick knows that Stradivarius instruments were considered the best ever made. Even today, the sound quality and precision cannot be matched. That's why they go for millions of dollars. The million-dollar question on Rick's mind now is this real? Is he actually holding an authentic Stradivarius violin? Rick says he does not think this is a real Stradivarius violin. He says the date is completely wrong.
An old cedar chest had a bunch of old quilts on top of it.
You know nothing about it? There was no paperwork in the box or anything? Actually, his name was Stradivarius. It wasn't Stradivarius.
Stradivarius, okay.
He Latinized his name. It was really common back then, like Christopher Columbus.
Yeah.
Rick is 99% sure this is a copy, but some copies are so well made that they are still very valuable. Not millions, but thousands. Rick, feigning ignorance, asks the seller what he wants to do with it. The seller says he wants to sell it. Rick asks how much he wanted for it. The seller says if it's a real one, he's hoping to get $1 million from it. Rick gave out a loud laugh.
Instruments were considered the best ever made. Many people would argue that even today, the sound quality and the precision cannot be matched. That's why they go for millions of dollars.
You're either the luckiest man alive or...
Rick knows the time to authenticate the merchandise is nigh. He tells the seller that he will have to call in a buddy of his to authenticate and appraise the violin. The seller was a bit confident. He has nothing to lose, except a potential $1 million out of nothing. Rick tells him if it turns out to be real, he will give him the $1 million instantly. A big smile crept up on the seller's face.
I'm 99% sure that this is a copy, but some copies were so well made, they're still worth a lot of money.
The expert says he's a violin maker. He has been doing it for 20 years now. Like all experts, he flexed his knowledge by giving them a brief lecture about the history of Stradivarius violins. He examined both sides of the violin and said the type of wood used checks out. The seller could not contain his joy. The expert says it's what any violin maker would use. The smile disappeared from the seller's face like a thief in the night.
There could be something here.
All right. And when he confirms it's a Stradivarius, I want my $1 million.
Well, if it's a real Stradivarius, I'd give you $1 million in a minute. Let me get him in here, he can take a look at it, and maybe we can figure it out.
The expert opened up the violin to examine it. The seller watched on nervously. Moment of truth. The expert says it was interesting after looking inside. He noted that the bar inside was a good sign. The suspense was killing the seller, he had to voice out. He saw another thing inside that was typical of a Stradivari. He finally gave his verdict that it was a copy and not the real deal.
Antonio Stradivari gave us the modern violin, essentially. He improved upon the sound. He gave the instrument more power. He wanted a violin that could project over a Baroque-sized orchestra.
The seller was dumbfounded. The expert says it was not worth more than $500. The seller asks Rick how much he's willing to buy it. Much to his disappointment, Rick says he's not buying it. The violin was not worth the trouble of refurbishing and selling. The seller was left red-faced, but there was nothing he could do.
A little feel of the style of the instrument inside. See if I can see any interior construction. Well, this is really interesting. I think I might have found something.
A seller brings a silver watch that is supposedly 400 years to Rick's shop. Will he get his money's worth? A seller walks into Pawn Stars looking to get rid of what he claims is a 400 years old watch. Rick is not a rookie when it comes to stuff like this. He sees all sorts every day. Not everything that glitters is gold. In this case, not every silver watch is 400 years old. The seller says he wants $1,000 for it. Time, they say, is money, and he wasn't fooling around. Rick opens the watch up, and it was as advertised, 92.5% silver.
Got a watch here I want to get rid of, $1,000. Let's talk some money.
Okay, you're pretty sure of yourself.
Absolutely. I know it's English made, and I've been told it's about 400 years old.
Rick explains further to the seller what the markings on the inside of the watch means. There was an anchor that means it was made in Birmingham, England, right close to it as a T, which was the date code. The seller asks Rick if he knows what year it was. He really wants to know if the watch was 400 years old. Rick says he can look it up for him. The seller says, okay. Rick went inside to consult his reference books.
Found the pocket watch at a motel. I contacted the police department, and the lady said, I guess it belongs to you. Just put it in your pocket. So that's what I did. I put it in my pocket and kept it.
Moment of truth. The seller looks on nervously as Rick checks the date online. He had everything riding on the outcome. The value of the silver watch depends on how old it will be. It could go from $1,000 to nothing in a blink of an eye. In this case, in the refresh rate of an online page. Voila! Rick shows him the page. It was 1893.
See this little T right here? That would be the date code for Birmingham, England.
So do you know what year it was, or?
Well, that's the great thing. I can look all this stuff up.
1893. That means the watch is a little newer. It was nowhere near the 400 years mark the seller had hoped it would be. What a bummer for him. But on the bright side, it was around 120 years old. It was still a remarkable piece of history, a blast from the past. Rick says it runs very well for an old watch, some silver lining for the seller.
And here we go, right here. 18.
Rick breaks the sad news to the seller. They don't go for a lot of money. The seller looked at Rick, then at the watch. Disappointment was written all over his face like a newspaper headline on a busy Monday morning. The seller finally gathered himself and asked Rick how much the watch was worth.
1893, that's a little
Newer.
Yeah, not quite 400 years in it.
Yeah, but it is 120 years old.
Rick tells the seller $100 with the emotions of a seasoned KGB agent in the Cold War. The seller could not believe his ears. He was not having it. He says the silver alone is worth more than that. Rick objected that it was $20 worth of silver. He says it was silver, not gold, and silver is worth $22 an ounce.
They don't go for a lot of money.
Okay, what do we?
The seller asks for $500. Rick says no. He tells the seller that the $100 he is offering was more than a generous offer. The seller sighed, tapping his fingers before asking for $200. Rick didn't budge. $100 or nothing. The seller shook his head, saying he can't sell it for $100. Rick raised his offer to $120. The seller didn't budge. The seller collected his watch and left.
Yes.
No, there's $100 worth of silver in it.
No, there's probably like $20 worth of silver there. Or it's silver, it's not gold. Silver's worth 22 bucks an ounce. You probably got right around an ounce of silver there.
Will this vintage copy of Washington Irving's Rip Van Winkle fetch good money for the seller? A seller walks in holding a vintage copy of Washington Irving's Rip Van Winkle. Could it be a first edition? Rick and the seller both shared their sentiment about the book, and they also shared a laugh. The seller says the book is over 100 years old. He's hoping to get $1,500 for it. Rick certainly knows who Washington Irving was because he also wrote Sleepy Hollow. As huge as the book is, it's just 60 pages, so a short story.
But when he wakes up, his wife is dead, his kids are grown, everything has changed.
I've given it my best shot, but I couldn't sleep for as long as he did.
There were some wonderful illustrations in the book. One of them caught Rick's eyes. He says he never saw drawings like this that early. The artist responsible for illustrations was Rackham. His names were boldly written on the cover. Rick says it was really popular around the 1900s and 19-teens to make expensive books. Good early signs for the seller.
The pictures in the thing are fantastic. I'm hoping to get 1,500 today.
This is definitely an interesting book.
Rick confesses to the seller that he was intrigued. He asks the seller what he was planning to do with it. The seller says he wants $1,500 for it. Rick gave him a brief stare. Rick tells him the condition of the book wasn't looking pretty, which was usually not a good sign. The seller waved it off that it was just a little scuffed. Rick pointed out that it was not a first edition since it was made in 1909.
I've never really seen drawings like this from this early. Do you know who the artist is?
A guy named Rackham, I think it's on the front.
I can almost guarantee you he was a really famous artist.
The seller suggested that it could be a first edition with illustrations. Rick tells him that the first edition was the major selling point in books like this. He knew he had to call in an expert to authenticate and appraise it. Like the saying goes, doing it by the books. The seller had no objections.
It's really, really interesting. I'm intrigued. What were you looking to do with it?
I'm looking to get 1,500 for the book.
Okay,
The expert came in and picked the book up. Rick tells her that he knows it's not a first edition Rip Van Winkle. The expert agrees, but she noted that this particular one was illustrated by Rackham in the early 20th century. She says the period was called the Golden Age of Illustration, and Rackham was the king of that golden age. Good signs for the seller once again.
Well, it could be a first edition with the illustrations.
yeah, and that's what makes the money in these kind of books. But I have a friend, she's probably like one of the top.
The expert asks Rick what he was worried about. Rick says he doesn't know how much it was worth. The expert says they have to check if it was a first edition illustrated by Rackham, because those ones go for as high as $9,000. Wow. The seller started smiling. Moment of truth. The expert, after examining the first page, says it was not a first edition. The first edition came out in 1905. This was 1909. The seller could not believe it.
Winkle was written like, what, in the 1820s, somewhere around there?
Yeah, early 19th century Van Winkle, of course, by Washington Irving, one of the great early American authors.
The expert says given the condition, it will be around $300. Rick cracks a little joke after the expert left, but the seller was not in the mood for jokes. Rick says he will give the seller $50. The seller gave Rick a mean stare. Rick says even though the expert says it was worth $300, he doesn't see it flying off the shelf. The seller says $175. Rick says no. The highest he could go was $75. After much hesitation, the seller agrees.
All right. The first thing we need to see is whether or not it's a first edition illustrated by Arthur Rackham. Oftentimes, that can get up into thousands easily.
A seller comes in, hoping to sell a 19th century magazine containing a Mark Twain short story. A seller comes in holding an old issue of the Atlantic Monthly, a magazine well known to Rick. The seller says it was the first edition of a true story by Mark Twain. Rick's curiosity was instantly aroused. The seller believes it's very rare and worth a substantial amount of money. Rick gave a brief rundown of what he knows about Mark Twain to the seller. At least he knows his onions.
Hey, how's it going?
Good, how are you?
I'm doing great. I guess this is the Atlantic Monthly.
Yes, we have a first edition of a true story by Mark Twain.
The seller claims this was one of the first published works by Mark Twain. That is a bold claim. He pointed out a monologue by a real slave that was written in the magazine. The seller definitely had Rick's curiosity. Now he has Rick's full attention. Rick knows that Mark Twain was one of America's greatest authors, and he has seen his works go for obscene money. There's definitely money to be made here if it's real.
Well, it's the Atlantic Monthly. It was a very popular magazine. There was short stories, maybe a little bit of news, but it was something a little more than you got in your local newspaper, and people had subscriptions to it. Samuel Clemens actually took the pen name up.
Rick is not entirely sure if this was really a first edition or one of many monthly editions. He asks the seller if he could open it. He went straight to page 591, the page containing the Mark Twain short story, the most valuable page in the magazine, and there it was, the short story with Mark Twain's name at the ending. Rick says it's cool. He asks the seller how much he wants for it.
But also one of the first published works by him. It's actually a monologue from a real slave that he overheard. It's his rendition.
The seller started talking about the unique nature of the magazine, how everything was still in the original cover and all, and how it was nearly impossible to find. Rick has been in this business long enough to know exactly what was coming. The seller says he wants $2,500 for it. Rick puffs the air, then sighed. Money aside, he needed to know how collectible the magazine was. Magazines aren't usually worth much money.
I'm just not sure on this. May I open it?
Sure, certainly.
So we're on page 591. There it is, Mark Twain.
It was time to call in an expert to take a look at it. The seller had no objections, and he was looking forward to what the expert had to say. The expert came in, and Rick showed her the magazine with Mark Twain in it. She says it was cool. She gave a brief history of Mark Twain's exploits around 1874 and how he rose to success.
Nearly impossible to find. I was thinking around $2,500.
You know, I just don't know how collectible this is. You know, it's a magazine, it's not a book. And
she says the Atlantic Monthly started in the 1850s. She says Twain and the magazine had a mutually beneficial relationship. Rick asks her what the magazine was worth. She picked it up and examined it closely. She says there were some magazines with values. The seller looks on hopefully. She says in the collectible world, magazines don't compare to books. Rick started laughing.
If you don't mind, I'd really like to call someone and have take a look at it.
Sure, that'd be fine.
I will be right back. I will get her down here and maybe we can figure something. Maybe you're right on the price, I don't know, but It just seems a little stiff.
The experts say the value will be about $100. The seller could not hide his disappointment. The seller says he doesn't agree with that, but he respects the opinion of the expert. The expert says that there was really no market for this type of magazine. Rick tells the seller that given the huge difference between the value, doing business will be impossible. The seller kept his cool and left with his magazine.
Sort of the height of literary criticism, published all of the major American writers. And in the 1870s, the Atlantic was starting to lose subscriptions.
A seller comes in with a pair of Hollywood-signed gloves. Is it real or fake? A woman walks into Pawn Stars and drops a pair of gloves on the table like a gauntlet. Corey asks her what they are. She says it was a pair of gloves that her great-aunt left her. She claims the signatures on it were from old movie stars. She pointed out the most notable one, Clark Gable. Corey was impressed, but the impression doesn't sell antiquities. He knows this. The seller is hoping to get $800 to $1,000 for the gloves.
Hey, how you doing?
Hi there, how you doing?
What are these?
These are a pair of gloves that my great-aunt left me. They have a bunch of old movie star signatures on them.
The seller says her great-uncle was the mayor of San Francisco, so he normally dragged his sisters along and they met a lot of cool famous people. This was from one of those parties. Corey half-heartedly says, all right. You could still see the doubt on his face. Corey says the Clark Gable signature was huge because he was the main man in Hollywood during his time.
He knows how much I love 50s movies and old Hollywood. I'm going to be asking $1,000 for the gloves. I think the lowest I would go would...
The seller tells Corey she was hoping for $1,000 for them. Corey says if the signatures were real, it could be worth some money. He doesn't know if all the signatures are legit, so he has to call in a favor from an expert. The seller didn't object. The seller is pretty confident that the signatures are 99% real because her great-aunt left the gloves for her.
Got to meet a lot of cool people, and he always dragged his sisters along. So this was from one of their many parties.
All right. You got Cesar Romero.
The expert came in. Corey tells him what he was looking at, a pair of gloves with Cesar Romero and Clark Gable's signature. The expert says, wow, time to get to work. He started off by giving a lecture on how huge Cesar Romero was as a villain in Hollywood. Corey asks him to take a closer look to authenticate if the signatures were real or fake. The seller was a bit nervous.
I was thinking roughly $1,000.
Okay. I mean, if they're all real, I mean, it could be they'd be worth some money.
Cool.
But I don't know if all these signatures are legit.
The experts bring out an original Cesar Romero signature to compare with. He points out how the letters are arranged and the cursiveness. The first signature checks out. Good signs for the seller. The next one was that of Clark Gable's. There were some notable similarities, but unfortunately, he wasn't quite sold on it. The most important signature.
So we have a pair of opera gloves, one of which has signatures from some 50s actors. We've got Cesar Romero and Clark Gable.
Wow. You know, Cesar Romero is one of the top villains of...
The expert pointed out the shapes of the G on both signatures. He says they were entirely different. The seller interrupted, saying that Clark Gable was known to have two types of Gs. The expert tells her the one she was referring to was early on in his career. The expert asks if it was a woman that got it signed. The seller says yes. He says because the signature has a woman's flourish to it. Hoodwinked.
O to the M. He brings this O at the end. He does the same thing here. The next one, the one that was the most important one to look at, is Clark Gable. And I see some similarities. The B, L, E. And you take a look here, it's pretty similar.
The experts say the gloves with Clark Gable's signature were worth between $150 to $200. The seller kept her cool, obviously disappointed at the low value and at her great-aunt. She tells Corey that the sentimental value is probably worth more to her. She says she will probably wear them now since they are fake. She left with her gloves.
Can't get beyond is when I see the G on here and I see this G, I see a whole different signature. I'm looking at a G that's connected to the A, goes to the BLE.